Okay, folks, this is the last lecture in my civil rights series. So we're looking at basically the late 60s, I would say the late 60s. President Lyndon Baines Johnson's domestic policy was called the Great Society. It was a focus on ending poverty in the United States. President Lyndon Baines Johnson had two major experiences in his life that really helped shape his presidency. One was his experience right out of college teaching the kids of migrant farm workers in the Valley in Texas. He never experienced such abject poverty. He didn't realize that such poverty existed. Like I said, he asked his friends and his family to send coats and shoes and gloves and food and school supplies, everything to help these kids out. And the other thing was a book he read in 1962 by Michael Harrington called The Other America. Harrington argued, among other things, that at least 20% of Americans don't have enough food to eat every day, don't have proper housing, don't have access to medicine, and that 20% are unemployed. That's a tremendous amount. So he becomes president and he decides to do something about it. He launches what he calls an unconditional war on poverty. I believe that was in a speech he was giving at the commencement of University of Michigan. And he does see himself as a new FDR, fighting both the foreign wars and the domestic issues. Well, one of the things that he established was called the Office of Economic Opportunity. The Office of Economic Opportunity will spend about $1.7 billion of federal aid. It will be led by the brother-in-law, or a brother-in-law of President Kennedy, named Sargent Shriver. Now, Harrington was right, and 20% of this country was in abject poverty. That $1.7 billion would come to about $70 a person, so that's not really a lot. It will do a couple things long term. It's going to establish the federal lunch program and the federal milk program, among other things. It's also going to establish the community action program, and two things that come out of that. One is Head Start, and one are the local health centers. Head Start was and is a program to help kids who are not prepared to enter kindergarten, to succeed in kindergarten. Basically, it's the poor kids. The idea is that middle-class families are able to give their kids stuff they need to be prepared. Proper nutrition and playtime and toys like blocks and puzzles. They teach their kids to read and to count, and they know letters and numbers and, basic stuff that 5-year-olds need to succeed in kindergarten, while poor families don't do that. The television becomes the babysitter. There are no books. There are no blocks. There is no active playtime to expand their imagination. And so intellectually and socially, poor kids are not prepared to succeed and do get left behind. So Head Start was to help these poor kids get ready to succeed in school. And then the health centers that are still with us today. Another aspect of the civil rights movement is black power. Notice the closed fist hand salute. Malcolm X was one of the most well-known speakers of the black power movement, or certainly the antithesis of the traditional civil rights nonviolent approach of King and Abernathy. He said racism doesn't exist. He called it whiteism. That racism was a top-to-bottom phenomenon, not a bottom-top, and whites were on top, black people were at the bottom, so he called for an end to whiteism. Well, he was a pseudo-Muslim. He was a member of what became the what is the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was started by an African-American fella in Detroit who called himself Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad preached the idea that Islam was created by God for black people, specifically black people of the United States. So he was not taught the orthodox version of Islam, and later on in his life he traveled to Mecca. This is one of the central tenets of Islam. If you can't afford it, if you're healthy enough, once in your lifetime take the annual pilgrimage to Mecca. a lot of Christians take the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Well, Muslims go to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And he was transformed. He had no idea what Islam was really about. He had no idea the types of people who are Muslims, and his eyes were just awakened. And first he comes back and does two things. One, he changes his name to Haj Malik al-Shabazz, and two, he really tones down his rhetoric. Well, on February 21st, 1965, he's assassinated in New York. And there are massive uprisings. Over 100 major U.S. cities just explode in flames and violence. Watts was probably the most famous in 1965. And there was this animosity that existed between the police and the African-American community of Los Angeles, the Watts area. For example, the police referred to their batons as, quote, nigger knockers. Well, there was extensive damage all over this country, and President Johnson gets on TV and calls for, quote, an end of white racism. Play on words of what Malcolm X said. He calls for massive rebuilding. He calls for massive educational or training opportunities for African Americans, and he calls for this national system of economic equality. That white people earn more than black people. So what we're going to figure out is the difference between those two, say in any city, and we're going to give more money to African Americans to equal that to what whites were making, until eventually African Americans can graduate college or training or whatever they need to be more economically successful. So that idea will be shot down by Congress. They'll support the 64 Civil Rights Act. They'll support the 65 Voting Rights Act. They'll support the 1968 Fair Housing Act. They're not going to support economic redistribution. Now, in 1966, in Oakland, California, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and a few others established this group called the Black Panthers. Power to the people, that was one of their mottos. The Black Panthers wore uniforms. They were separatists. Similar to Marcus Garvey, they believed that white and black people cannot live together, so they called for black people to form their own communities, have their own industry, their own schools, their own police, their own everything. They were separatists in the very sense of the word. Well, heading in one of their newspapers, they're going to get the attention of the FBI. African-American guys marching in uniform calling for separation is going to get the FBI's attention. It did with Marcus Garvey. It does again in the 1960s. Then we have a African-American civil rights leader named Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael graduated from Howard University. When he was there, he was a leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he was everywhere in the civil rights movement. He was all the major actions and activities. He was a freedom rider in '61. He was at Selma, Alabama. Hell no, we won't go. That was the chant he created. He created regarding U.S. protest about Vietnam. And then he was in the Black Panthers. He was the honorary prime minister. And then he became more Pan-African. Garvey had this revelation too. Stokely Carmichael does. He changes his name to Kwame Ture, and he starts this organization called the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. Photograph of Black Panthers protesting. Notice the glove. Wait a second. There was a chapter of Black Panthers at NYU. They were north and south, east and west. Yeah. There we go. April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr., Jesse Jackson, and Ralph Abernathy and others. There's Abernathy. There's Jesse Jackson. There's King. They're in Memphis, Tennessee to give a speech that we now call the Mountaintop Speech in support of African-American garbage workers. Memphis had this, or Memphis Sanitation Department had this policy that white garbage workers would work the day and African-American garbage workers will work at night. There was unequal pay, all sorts of problems. So King goes there, shows his support, gives this speech about the end is near and everything's going to be fine, it'll work out, except he may not make it. So there's been a lot of interesting mythology about this speech. Well, April 4th, 1968, King is assassinated while on the balcony of the hotel.
Direct from our newsroom in Washington, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Russ Hodge in Memphis, Tennessee, Dan Rather in New York, Bernard Kalb in Saigon, Marvin Kalb in Wellington, New Zealand, and Burquette in Khe Sanh, South Vietnam.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene. Officers also reportedly chased and fired on a radio-equipped car containing 2 white men. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of a second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In the friend's words, the bullet exploded in his face. Police, who have been keeping a close watch over the Nobel Peace Prize winner because of Memphis' turbulent racial situation, were on the scene almost immediately. They rushed the 39-year-old Negro leader to a hospital where he died of a bullet wound in the neck. Police said they found a high-powered hunting rifle about a block from the hotel, but it was not immediately identified as the murder weapon. Mayor Henry Loeb has reinstated the dusk-to-dawn curfew he imposed on the city last week when a march led by Dr. King erupted in violence. Governor Buford Ellington has called out 4,000 National Guardsmen, and police report that the murder has touched off sporadic acts of violence in a Negro section of the city. In a nationwide television address, President Johnson expressed the nation's shock.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence.
Dr. King had returned to Memphis only yesterday, determined to prove that he could lead a peaceful mass march in support of striking sanitation workers, most of whom are Negroes.
The New York Times called King's assassination, quote, a national disaster. The riots that followed Malcolm X's assassination were nothing compared to the riots that followed King's assassination. 27,000 African Americans will be jailed. The mayor of Chicago, for example, orders a 24-hour curfew and orders his police to shoot to kill anybody who's out of doors. Federal government puts machine gun posts around the federal buildings in Washington, D.C. It's just, well, President Johnson calls for federal money to rebuild, and many African-American leaders refuse. They want these scars there as a monument, as a reminder. Mexico City hosted the Olympics in October of 1968. A lot of controversy. 68 is a horrible, horrible, horrible year, which I'll discuss here in the next lecture or two. Before the Olympics began, the government of Mexico had a major sweep of Mexico City, getting rid of homeless people and prostitutes and just the poor in general, you know, to literally, quote, clean up Mexico City in preparation for the Olympics. Well, students throughout Mexico came to Mexico City to protest what was going on, and the Mexican military opened fire. We don't know how many were killed. The estimates differ wildly from the Mexican government's estimates to the estimates of the survivors of the student protesters. Well, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, two Americans, they came in first and third place in a track and field competition. They got their medals. And as the American anthem is being played, because Tommy Smith came in first, they donned these black gloves and raised them over their hands, dropped their heads in a silent protest to all the horrible things that happened in 1968. Racism in general, and of course what happened in Mexico City just prior to the Olympics. They will be quickly removed from the stands, put on a plane, stripped of their medals, and sent back to the United States. Which raises the question, Whatever happened to Ella Barker's beloved community?